How you doing, everybody? Welcome back to Before I Forget. This is my YouTube channel, inspired by my Instagram channel, 1985 Road Dog. That Instagram channel features photos of my life in music, first as a fan and then as somebody that worked in the music business in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This chapter, I'm going to talk about fashion and t-shirts and stage clothes and stuff like that, because people have been sending me messages about that kind of stuff and, you know, where they get the clothes or how it all happened. You know, again, I'm speaking from my experience as a fan and as somebody that worked in the business. So, you know, on a fan level, I mean, in the golden days, you know, if you were, you know, saw the Rolling Stones in 1972 or Aerosmith in 1975, the clothes these guys wore on stage, you couldn't buy anywhere. It was very, you know, I mean, if you lived in New York City, maybe you could find a store that sold that stuff. A lot of it came from Europe, from England. You know, a lot of the stuff Aerosmith would wear in the early days were, you know, shops in Boston and stuff that sold vintage, or not even vintage at that time, but like British clothing, Granny Takes a Trip, certain suit designers and all this kind of stuff, clothing, women's clothing. A lot of it was very unisex. And it was, you know, that's kind of how it really, you know, started in a way, you know. Eventually, the Stones, Mick Jagger specifically, and Steven Tyler, you know, started having designers make them outfits for the stage. Stuff they would wear on stage and not wear out in public. But for those two guys, Mick Jagger and Steven Tyler, a lot of what they wore in public would also be similar to what they would wear on stage almost. It was, you know, that was the key is, well, those guys were making a statement, were performing on stage. I mean, Steven Tyler wore some outfits that you wouldn't wear in the street. Not so much Mick Jagger, but Steven Tyler. And then, of course, you know, around 73, Elton John was, you know, and Bowie. And then it started becoming very outrageous in the dress style. But you couldn't buy these clothes anywhere. If you were a kid living in the you know, Georgia or Texas or anywhere in America for that matter, you'd look at David Bowie or Mick Jagger or these guys in magazines, Steven Tyler, and you'd be like, where could you get clothes like this? It's like you couldn't. It was the same thing with T-shirts. You know, when you would see a rock star wear a certain T-shirt, you couldn't get that T-shirt anywhere. Like, for example, Ronnie Van Zant, the singer of Leonard Skinner, would wear the Showco T-shirt. It said Showco, which was a lighting company that toured, you know, did tours with all the bands back in the 70s. So if you had a Showco shirt, you only got it from somebody that worked for Showco. You couldn't buy it in a store. You couldn't buy it on Amazon. They didn't have it in the mall. You know, but that shirt became like, wow, that's cool, Showco. Or, you know, I've seen picture of Danny Fields. If you know who Danny Fields is, look him up. You know, he's sitting with Lou Reed and Andy Warhol, and his T-shirt says Sunset Marquis, which is a hotel in Hollywood. You couldn't buy those anywhere except at those places. So T-shirts were much cooler then. Today, everything's been reproduced, and it's just, you don't even know what's real, what's fake anymore. But the cool shirts, the cool T-shirts were things you had to go to that business or know somebody that worked there. You know, back in the 80s, I had a T-shirt that Mick Cripps gave me, actually, that said New Wave Hookers, which was a porn movie in the 80s. Directed by these guys, the Dark Brothers. Just like they did this stylized kind of, you know, 80s porn movies. But one of them was called New Wave Hookers. Now, Mick Cripps got that T-shirt from somebody, and he gave it to me at one point. And then anytime I wore that shirt, people would be like, wow, where'd you get that? You know, so the T-shirt thing and the clothes thing was very, you know, you had to hunt those clothes down. You know, if you wanted a Trash and Vaudeville T-shirt or a CBGB's T-shirt, you know, you had to go to the place. You had to go to the venue. I mean, Trash and Vaudeville, you had to go to Trash and Vaudeville. No one sold Trash and Vaudeville shirts outside of the store. And then CBGB's, even in its heyday, I don't even think they had a T-shirt. CBGB's didn't have a T-shirt till later on, much later on. But, you know, so it was much more about the search and, you know, then you kind of like start going into the late 70s and, you know, you have the emergence of Van Halen and David Lee Roth and, you know, I mean, what they were wearing. I mean, Roth, for the most part, you couldn't find those kind of clothes anywhere. You know, and then you move through the 80s and you've got the Motley Crues and the Rats, and then it became about clothes that were just stage clothes, custom-made stage clothes. And then it kind of lost a lot of for me, it was very manufactured. Everybody just used the same designers and everybody had the same people getting them clothes. And then you had people, you know, clothing companies like Lip Service and all these Hollywood clothing companies started giving everybody clothes and everybody wore the same clothes. And it was just like, it really became watered down. And then now you have the emergence of Amazon and the internet and everything else and people reproducing clothes and T-shirts and stuff. It's not like it was. You know, when you went to see Steven Tyler of Aerosmith in 1977 on stage, he looked like no one else, and no one looked like him, and he had clothes that you couldn't get anywhere. And then if you saw him after the show in his street clothes, he had on clothes that no one could get anywhere. I remember seeing Kiss, the guys from Kiss, when I saw them in 75. I remember seeing them at the, you know, very briefly, when the opening band had just started. The opening band was Styx. This is 1975, a live tour. And I remember seeing Paul Stanley come out, trying to peek out of the curtain to watch Styx for a second. And, I mean, he was, you know, platform heels, you know, velvet pants. I mean, he had clothes on that you couldn't buy anywhere. You had to get them from somebody in New York City at like maybe 2 stores had that kind of stuff. One of them being a store called JJ Flash, which was a cool rock star clothing store. But they got a lot of their clothes imported from Britain and Europe. Crazy platforms and that kind of thing. So it's like anything else, you know, back in the olden golden days of rock and roll, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, by the 90s, it kind of collapsed in on itself with the arrival of grunge and Cobain and all that kind of stuff and Pearl Jam. And then the audience started looking like the people on stage, and it was kind of fashion was over in rock and roll. And the scene really kind of, the music continued, but the glitz of it all kind of died out. But when I, you know, working for LA Guns, you know, those guys had some custom made clothes. Most of the time, you know, Kelly and Mick would get like custom made leather pants or custom made pants. And then that would be all they would have made. And then they would supplement that with their own shoes and their own coats and jackets and shirts and scarves and whatever. You know, I think, you know, in the beginning of LA Guns, there was some questionable stage clothes. I mean, you know, there was some stuff that Tracy wore that I was just like, ugh, you know, I was just kind of like, to me, it was very not cool, but again, everybody's got different tastes. You know, but it's very rare when a band can really influence a fashion trend and change everything and the way rock and music and heavy rock and hard rock and metal and how it was all perceived. You know, I mean, in the metal thing, you know, coming out of Britain with Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and all those bands with the studs and the leather and studs and the, you know, it was a very macho kind of thing. That was a different kind of a fashion, much more about the street and more edgy, in line with what the audience in Britain that time was about, the kids that went to see those bands. But, you know, I credit Rob Halford for the whole studs and leather thing. But other than that, you know, then you have Guns N' Roses, who comes along, and to me, that was they took it all. They took all the best stuff of the 70s fashion with a little bit of a modern twist, not much, a little goth thrown in there, whatever it might be. Axl was, you know, all over the place style-wise for a bit, but he was always cool. Guns N' Roses always looked great. No one looked like Guns N' Roses. They didn't have anything custom-made at all, nothing. Everything they wore was either something somebody gave them or they bought in a thrift store or whatever. You know, Guns N' Roses were the band that brought back the cowboy boots, you know, that everybody, overnight, every glam band started wearing cowboy boots. It was like so obvious to me. First person I saw wear cowboy boots with their pants tucked in them and all that was, you know, Axl Rose, 87. And if you want to go back with the cowboy boot thing, that was really Joe Perry from Aerosmith was the first guy that I ever saw. To this day, in all the photos I've seen and all the rock and roll research I've done, I've never seen anybody wearing the cowboy boots outside the pants. Joe Perry had really tight leathers on, and he had them tucked into the cowboy boots, and the cowboy boots were high ones. They came up close to his knee. And I remember seeing a picture of Joe Perry wearing the cowboy boots with a flannel tied around his waist in a stadium, and I was like, wow. This is like 77, 78. Aerosmith took that whole cowboy boot thing and the whole Aerosmith vibe of throwing together like a gypsy kind of like biker look and being totally original with it. No one looked like Guns N' Roses. I mean, they started the whole going back to being more natural, which then collided with, you know, around the same time, you know, early 90s, late 80s, early 90s with Metallica, and who were always a, you know, leather jacket, jeans, t-shirt kind of band, very much like the Ramones. You know, that kind of set it up for the grunge thing, where the audience and the band on stage looked exactly the same. You know, Guns N' Roses, people in the audience could try to look like Guns N' Roses, but you just couldn't quite pull it off. You know, and Slash is wearing like a $3,000 pair of leather pants, not custom made, just bought them. Type thing, you know, and no shirt and cowboy boots and, you know, his whole vibe, the whole band. Izzy, I mean, you know, Izzy wasn't the cowboy boot guy. Izzy was the Creepers guy. He wore the Creepers, the English Creepers, Doc Martens, that kind of thing. Those guys look cool right from the get-go. They look very British in a way, but not. As soon as I saw Guns N' Roses, a photo of them, like a promo photo for like, you know, in 87, I was like, wow, you know, is that changing it all? Because prior to that, everybody looked like Motley Crue and Rat. You know, and it was over, you know, it was too gaudy and too over the top. No, this is not a reflection or comment on the music. I'm talking about the look, but it was the 80s and that's what people look like. I mean, look at Madonna in the 80s. Look at the, you know, Cyndi Lauper, Michael Jackson. I mean, it was the 80s. So I can understand how the custom-made costume thing happened. But, you know, the guys in LA Guns didn't really have a lot of custom-made clothes. Once you get on the road, you've got a good pair of leather pants or a good pair of jeans and a jacket, and that's all you need. You pick up T-shirts all over the place. You know, you got a pair of cowboy boots. Or you got a pair of LA Guns were big with what I call the Beatle boots. Mick wore them, Steve Riley wore them. They were like the Beatles used to wear those kind of like Cuban heeled boots. You know, Kelly always, because his leg was a mess, Kelly always wore like high top sneakers. Rarely wore boots, occasionally, for a photo shoot maybe. Steve Riley wore whatever, didn't matter. And Tracy was always in, you know, cowboy boots or different kind of boots or, you know, whatever. But it was definitely, LA Guns weren't a big custom-made clothing band like, say, Warrant, you know, where those guys are wearing matching suits with pictures of women on the back and stuff. Like, you know, it's like, and listen, I'm not knocking Warrant, but that's what they did. They wore kind of like, whatever. Once it got to that point, that became part of the ridiculousness of the fashion trend of the 80s glam bands, was that matching suit stuff. But, you know, one thing I want to bring up what a lot of people don't know about is, you know, when I was in the late 70s and, you know, you're going to clubs in Manhattan and you're going to see bands in Manhattan, you know, there was the Capezios, which a lot of people don't know about. The white, all white, like ballet kind of like dance shoes, made famous by Mick Jagger. He would wear them on stage, Capezios. Flat, no sole, really, really thin. And, you know, you go to these clubs in Manhattan to see rock bands, not punk bands, but rock bands, and everybody's wearing Capezios. You know, it was like the thing. 78, 79, 80, into the early 80s. Capizios were a thing. But, you know, I don't remember any bands really wearing Capizios in the 80s. Nobody. You know, Motley Crue brought back the wearing the wrestling sneakers, the wrestling shoes, which were like sneakers kind of, but much different sole. Motley Crue were the wrestling shoe guys. And the original wrestling shoe guys, Rick Nielsen wore those. I remember seeing him wear the wrestling shoes in like 79 or 78 in there. But fashion, man, it's important. Most people don't get it. Everybody tries to copy. Be your own thing. Be original. Do something no one has done. Or rework it in a way that no one's doing. It's very rare I see any images online of anything new that looks like, wow, you know, look, who's this? It's important. But fashion, search out the cool stuff, man. You know, it's out there. Small run of T-shirt people that make small runs of T-shirts and sell them online. Always a good place to get cool T-shirts. But that's my fashion statement right now, man. Rock on. Thanks for tuning in. I'll speak to you guys soon. Later.